Hello readers, I'm the Avid reader, and today I'm doing another reading wrap-up, this time for October. So this month I've read 3 books. So I read an economics book, I read some Japanese fantasy literary fiction, and I read some economic history geopolitics. So the first book I read is Bad Samaritans, The Guilty Secrets of Rich Nations and the Threat to Global Prosperity by Ha-Joon Chang. So Chang is a South Korean left-wing economist. This is the second book I read by him, and it has very similar themes to the other one I read, 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism. So this book basically argues that it's a myth that countries got rich by the free market and free trade. He argues that almost all of the world got rich by rejecting the neoliberal formula. And he kind of lumps everything in that he considers bad as neoliberalism. So too much patents, free trade, independent central bank, less regulation, less state intervention, less government ownership of the means of production. He does make some interesting points. So for example, the patent system in the West, and especially in the United States, sometimes it's a bit overkill, so they can give patents for whatever, and it can sometimes inhibit innovation. And there's an interesting fact that a lot of innovation is carried out by universities and non-profit organizations that explicitly do not request patents and basically make the research public domain. And there's also the point where corruption does not necessarily correlate with whether a country will be rich or poor. So Ha-Joon Chang compares Zaire, so Mobutu's Congo, with Indonesia. Mobutu stole billions, as did Suharto in Indonesia. Suharto stole a lot more, but you actually had a tripling of GDP per capita under Suharto 30 years reign, compared to under Mobutu's 30-year reign, you actually had a GDP per capita decline. Although he does kind of ruin his point when he says, oh, but also corruption, you can also have that in private enterprises, and that, oh, corruption can be a good thing. But he also doesn't realize that the main reason for corruption is also that you have too much state involvement. Also, some of the things he blames on the free market, such as bailouts, have nothing to do with the free market. And he cites Nokia as an example of a successful state-backed enterprise, but as we know, about 20 years ago, the Nokia stock crashed badly, so it worked temporarily, but it wasn't sustainable. And he's a bit cherry-picky overall. He doesn't explain why poor countries turned towards neoliberalism in the 1980s, what caused the huge debt crisis and inflation crisis that necessitated that, which is of course state intervention. And he ignores the fact that you had more economic growth during the relatively free trade era among rich nations in the 50s and 60s than during the protectionist era of the 20s and 30s. And this was written in 2007, but there's some things that have happened in recent years that kind of undermines his thesis. So he thinks that China is a good example of a mixed market model, but now that China is embracing more statism in recent years, their economic growth has slowed down. So yeah, on Goodreads, I gave this book 2 out of 5 stars. It is intellectually stimulating, and it is interesting to get the perspective of a left-wing economist, but overall I disagree with a lot of his claims here. It simply isn't true that countries got rich through protectionism, because economic growth in the West started to take off in the 1850s, and that's when you had relatively more free trade and free markets. Not perfectly, but still more than previous centuries. And he claims there's a bunch of countries that had free trade policies that did not get rich. He does not name any examples though. Next book I read is We'll Prescribe You a Cat by Siyu Ishida. So this is a translated Japanese novel, and it's similar theme to previous books I've read, like Days at the Morisaki Bookshop, Welcome to the Yungnam Dong Bookshop, and Before the Coffee Gets Cold, in that it's about people finding solace by going to a specific place. So this is a mental health clinic. People have various problems in their lives, and they go there, and there's a weird young doctor who, his response to everything is, we'll prescribe you a cat. So you basically get a cat to take care of for a few days or a couple of weeks, and that one way or another offers you a new perspective and improves your everyday problems. So the problem is often connected to someone's job or someone's family. So there's also an underlying little fantasy element in the first 4/5 of the novel, but then the final fifth of the novel, the structure of the stories just suddenly changes in a way that I don't appreciate and becomes a lot more fantastical. I like that you had implied fantasy throughout this book, but I did not like that it became so explicit at the end. This is a decent novel. I liked the first 4/5. I didn't really like the final fifth. But if you really like cats, then it's highly likely that you like this book, because you get to see a lot of different cat personalities in this book, like social cats, a bit aloof cats, troublemaker cats, a bit of a unique novel. There's a lot of Japanese novels for some reason about cats, and they almost always have a magical element in them for some reason. And the final book I finished so far this month is Chip War by Chris Miller, The Fight for the World's Most Critical Technology. So chips, or semiconductors, are the crucial technology that is in everything basically nowadays, everything that's techy. So the phone I'm recording on, there's a bunch of semiconductors in it, as in my computer, as in a bunch of everyday things you can think about. And the world would basically ground to a halt without semiconductors nowadays. And here you basically have an economic history of this technology, so from about World War II up to today. And this book is from 2022. And there's some interesting things you learn in this book. For example, the Soviets during the Cold War, they did not really innovate, they just tried to copy the Americans and failed. And during the 80s, the Japanese were actually beginning to lead in the semiconductor industry, but then that declined. And there's actually a few key countries for semiconductor supply chains. So maybe the most important choke point is Taiwan, because here you have the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC for short, which is basically where a ton of advanced semiconductors are manufactured. And these chip facilities don't really have an equivalent. Map here of East Asia and their semiconductor distribution. So you have different type of chips, and there's a bunch of science in this book, so it got a bit confusing for me at times, but just bear with me. So Taiwan produces 90% of the most advanced chips. They also produce 41% of processor chips. And then you have Korea, which is also quite important, which produces 44% of memory chips and 8% of processor chips. Japan produces 17% of all chips. Singapore produces 5% of all chips. China produces 15% of all chips, but this is mainly low tech. And East Asia overall produces 90% of memory chips, 75% of processor chips, and 80% of silicon wafers. So if you have a war ever in East Asia involving any of these countries, you could have a big disruption to the supply chain. You've had some temporary disruptions previously, although the supply chain of chips remained quite resilient during COVID because all countries basically prioritized it. So even China, with their harsh lockdowns, made an exception to produce, manufacture, assemble these chips. The United States is also responsible for developing a ton of key technologies, especially in Silicon Valley. And then the Dutch firm ASML is responsible for one key technology produced that is crucial to producing chips, which is, I think, lithography, EUV, something like that. Yeah, it's complicated. But anyways, these interconnections make the world very vulnerable. So China is trying to produce domestically more and more different parts of the supply chain. There's also an idea that if you have a war over Taiwan, China could incapacitate Taiwan's defenses and take over Taiwan without destroying the TSMC facilities. But then you also have the risk where a bunch of Taiwanese scientists might just say, okay, I'm leaving, I'm going to the States, or I'm going to South Korea. I'm not staying behind and working for my sworn enemy, the People's Republic of China, instead of the Republic of China. So yeah, if you want an economic history of chips, if you really want to understand how important they are to today's world, then you should definitely check out this book, although it will be a hard read, at least it was for me. One final interesting thing about this book is Moore's Law. So that's invented by one of the top chips scientists, and it basically means that you can put more and more chips on a smaller and smaller surface, and this increases exponentially. So it's something like the amount of chips you can put on the surface doubles every couple years, and odds are this Moore's law will continue. So now this makes chips more efficient, but also some parts extremely expensive, and you have companies like Apple that are trying to produce their own chips, and because TSMC manufactures a ton of key things, basically for all chips companies who design stuff, it is very lucrative for Taiwan's economy. And an interesting thing about this book also is the amount of state aid involved in this. So you had a lot of private-public partnerships, but it was not completely statist, socialist. So the Soviets failed, Mao's version failed. What Xi is trying to do in China kind of works, but kind of doesn't, because it's extremely inefficient and also often very corrupt, because you're just spending money without any checks. So this book maybe mitigates a bit my free market ideology, although it's still quite clear that it's individuals driving a lot of this innovation. So for example, the boss of TSMC for a while was Maurice Chang. He was a key person, as was, I think, Andy Grove, Jack Kilby, Bob Noyce. You have a few teams of scientists that have made the world so much technologically more developed and efficient and richer. It's amazing. So these were the 3 books I read this month. We recently hit 1,000 subscribers, so thank you for that. And you can expect a celebratory live stream soon. But otherwise, I'm the Avid Reader, and I will see you readers next time.